Hello, 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 hello.
Hey, what's up? Sorry I'm
Hey,
late. I couldn't find the link.
it's okay. It's okay. You made it. That's the most important part. So we have both of our panelists here, and I'd like to introduce myself to everyone. My name is Rico Washington, and I'm one of the team leads with Street Riders NYC. Tonight's discussion will be about white allyship in Black social justice movements. Today we have our two panelists with us. And before we get into their introductions, and their illustrious achievements, I just want to let you all know a little bit about Street Riders. Street Riders NYC is a collective, a movement, and a community born in the streets of New York City that coalesced in protest and connected during the social unrest surrounding the police killings of unarmed Black citizens in the spring of 2020. Street Riders NYC has a collective interest in cycling to protest while providing cycling support and protection to other protest groups across the city, focusing on issues of justice for the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, as well as police reform, racial equity, and community direct action. Those of you who are not aware, you can follow us and stay abreast of all of our goings on at any platform, being Facebook, Twitter, and also Instagram at Street Riders NYC. And with that, we will get into the introductions for our gracious hosts, one being Shawnda Chapman. Shawnda Chapman is director of the Girls Fund Initiative at the Miss Foundation for Women. Prior to joining the organization, Shawnda worked as a lead program specialist on a national initiative at the Vera Institute of Justice, which was aimed at preventing and ending girls' incarceration. She also served as director of the Beyond the Bars Fellowship Program at Columbia University's Center for Justice. Partially based on her own experiences, her work has focused on racial justice, gender justice, and understanding the ways girls of color get pushed into the criminal justice system. With a particular focus on marginalized and vulnerable populations, Shawnda has a broad experience developing well as implementing research, monitoring, and evaluation materials both domestically and internationally. Shawnda sits on the board of Black Women's Blueprint, a transnational organization that works to end all forms of violence against Black women and girls. She also serves on the advisory board of the Southern New Hampshire University's Global Education Movement, an initiative that works to increase refugee access to tertiary education. Shawnda holds a bachelor's in sociology as well as a master's in applied social research. Our next panelist would be Joseph E. Flynn Jr. Joseph is an associate professor of curriculum and instruction at Northern Illinois University. His work centers on the intersection of race, curriculum, and social justice. His book, White Fatigue, Rethinking Resistance for Social Justice, explores how, despite the pleas and research of critical scholars, what passes for multicultural education in schools is often promotion of human relations and tolerance rather than a sustained critical examination of how race and racism shapes social, political, economic, and educational opportunities for various groups, both historically and currently. He also both presented and published an impressive array of papers, including I Am So Tired of Talking About This, Understanding, Seeing, and Addressing White Fatigue and Racial Dialogues. He has also co-edited the text Rubric Nation, Critical Inquiries on the Impact of Rubrics in Education. Joseph holds a PhD in curriculum teaching and education policy, as well as a master's in curriculum studies. Thank you so much to both of our guests for being here and entertaining us with this conversation and their expertise. So, with that being said, I would like to just dole out the first question. The
Right,
definition.
I have a question before we get started. Can we get
Go
started?
ahead. Absolutely.
I just want to ask us here, sort of as a group of people, how real of a conversation are we actually going to have? Because and when I do these panels, there are times when I have to, you sit and you ask yourself, how much trouble do I intend to get into today? And I can give you this Shawnda, or we can have the Shawnda who feels very, very seen. Um, just by listening to Joseph's his bio, I was like, yeah. So I think we might be done here. He said all the things. I'm so tired too. Um, so yeah, I feel like I need some clarity. What are we doing here, y'all?
We're being very real. we're being very honest. This is something that a lot of people across the movement have been talking about longer than just the past 9 to 12 months. So we owe it to ourselves and everybody in attendance to be as honest as possible. So hopefully that answered your question. So white allyship. The definition of allyship seems to have been expounded on as of late. So there's lots of different people in the movement who feel like the term ally is a little bit too constrained. I was wondering if the panelists could make a distinction between the term ally and these other terms that have started to be introduced, such as advocate, accomplice, and co-conspirator. And do the lines of distinction in this language actually help or hurt Black activism? So anyone can jump in and answer that.
Joseph, I'm looking at you. I know you see me looking at you. I know you see it.
I'm looking at you. You were the first one to speak, so you gotta go.
You know what? I think I'll start. It's interesting, right? Because I think allyship, there's a sort of the what you say you are and then what you do of allyship. And I think that, we can talk about, terms like advocate and co-conspirator, but I think for most people, I think those distinctions are like they're lost on most of us, right? So for me, the process of allyship is sort of this process of sort of locating yourself constantly, and sort of having the vulnerability to sort of show up and learn and to unlearn, and to be iterative, and to make yourself comfortable sort of in that process of discomfort. And so knowing that you have to sort of let go of some control and that you have to cede some power. And I think until I don't know if you remember, Rico, we sort of talked about before, the idea that social justice starts with self, right? And so unless you really sort of start the process with sort of understanding who you are and what power you have and what power you're willing to let go of, I don't think it matters what you call yourself.
Okay. Thank you for that. Joseph, you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think, thinking about it historically, and I think this is something that is completely underrepresented in American popular culture and in the typical American school curriculum. But there were, in fact, a lot of white allies and accomplices throughout history. This isn't this isn't new business, and I think that that's one of the things that is so challenging for white folks. The idea that it's oftentimes that they don't have any real examples, any real role models in terms of what living an anti-racist life as a white person is like. It's when we talk about like the civil rights movement, for example, I think kind of in the popular imagination, we only really focus on African Americans. Now, without doubt, African Americans were central and key to the civil rights movement of the 60s and the 50s, but there were a number of white allies and accomplices that were also involved in the movement. Just thinking off the top of my head, you got like Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, who were murdered down in Mississippi. You've got people like Virginia Durr. You've got people like Jim Zwerg, who was really close friends with the great John Lewis. So I think it's important that white folks understand that they too have this history, and they ought to claim that history, but not claim it as a sense of arrogance, not in a sense of, oh, look at what we did too, but in the sense of, this is somebody that I can look toward in terms of understanding what an anti-racist life looks like.
Absolutely. So I'm glad you brought that up in terms of history, because we do understand that many people are under the assumption that white allyship is a new concept, particularly with this recent wave of Black Lives Matter protests. Not everybody, but a lot of people are under that impression. So, talk a little bit more about, I guess, the history of white allyship in the US specifically. Some examples that I can think of would, I guess technically be slavery abolitionists and the network of safer spaces that we now know as the Underground Railroad. Also, you mentioned this a little bit, Joseph, back in the 1960s. We were talking about the Freedom Riders and people of that nature. And then also there was a movie that was released, or I think a series, if I'm not mistaken, Free State of Jones. Was that the?
I think that was that a series? I know what you're talking about, but I can't remember if it was a feature or if it was a series.
Okay. So yeah, if anyone can kind of like, I guess, corral this concept of white allyship and spread it out again over the course of history, just so people understand the history of white allyship and Black movements, or the struggle for Black liberation in general.
Well, I think you can go all the way back into the 1500s, right? It's funny because we always talk about, Columbus in 1492, and then we kind of just skip to 1607 when Jamestown was founded. But there were people living in North America, which would become the North American British colonies, throughout the 1500s. And I think one of the assumptions about our race relations is that we've always been in these separate pockets. We've always, Black folks over here, Latinos over here, Indigenous over here, so on and so forth. But early colonial America was actually a much more cooperative of a space, and more inclusive to a certain degree of a space. Interracial relationships were not uncommon at that time, but this was also before we really started to see the invention of whiteness, taking root. The idea of race was being negotiated, so to speak, particularly in Western Europe, but also extending here into North America. But I think when we start thinking about allyship, we have to think about the fact that the laws that kind of shaped the way that we thought about race relations were implemented, right? They were designed, such as anti-miscegenation law, the illegalization of interracial marriages and relationships. Those were responses to problems that some felt we were having at the time. Others didn't agree with it, and those others that didn't agree with it weren't all Africans. White Europeans felt the same way. And then, of course, with the rise of slavery, you've got people like John Brown, as an example, is a severe abolitionist. And when I say severe, I mean he was for real. Some people thought he was crazy, or at least had mental health issues, pardon my language. But others thought that he was just deeply committed to this idea of being against slavery. And so I think throughout the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, you can always find these people, abolitionists, folks like William Lord Garrison, and the work they were doing, along with Frederick Douglass, to bring an end to the transatlantic slave trade and American slavery by extension. And that work carries all the way into today. When I think about white allies and accomplices, the first name that comes to my head right now is Heather Heyer, who, of course, was the young lady killed in Charleston a few years back.
Oh, yeah.
And you have people like Jane Elliott, who's a tough little lady, but her beginning, her anti-racist life started with trying to understand how to teach, trying to figure out a way of teaching her white class of elementary school kids the understanding of what Dr. King's message was about, as well as what's the experience of being marginalized racially. And so, again, I think we can't dismiss the number of white allies and accomplices that we've had throughout history. And without that recognition, it just makes it seem like we're just on opposite sides of the fence, throwing stones at each other.
Shawnda, do you have anything to add?
No, not per se. I think that not on the history. I've been involved in social movements for a lot of times, but I'm not a student of social movements. We know that there have been people sort of across history who sort of risked their sort of life. They've risked their livelihood to sort of combat sort of various sorts of injustices. So I think that I don't think there's a lot to say on that. For me, I think the question really is what what constitutes allyship,
Mm,
in any social movement, right?
mm,
And I think right now we're talking about um, white allyship, but I think sort of any process, like I said, social justice starts with self, and so for me, to just begin, one has to examine sort of what identities am I walking in the room with, and what privileges do those identities afford me, and sort of in any space, the work that I do really does sit at the intersection of sort of racial justice, social justice movements, and in just the same way that sort of I can benefit from allyship, I'm also an ally in the other spaces, right? So I'm constantly having to question, what are the ways that I'm showing up, for my cis siblings, my trans siblings, excuse me, and how can I be an ally in that space? So I think it's just important to name the fact that we all have these sort of various places of privilege and power, even for folks that have oppressed identities. And so just to start by naming that, and at any place, like, when I begin these discussions, there oftentimes I like to think about the fact that, like, I walk in the room as a queer woman. I walk in the room as a fat woman. I walk in the room as somebody who has a Southern working class family background. And those are some places, that I experience oppression, but, conversely, I experience privilege. And so what are the ways that I'm willing to sort of leverage, some of those places of power to create change. And so, yeah.
wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. The next thing I wanted to kind of like ask the panel is about white ally fatigue. James, you got a whole book and a whole catalog of journal papers that you've written about that. You've extrapolated that across the course of the chapters of your book. But I'm just wondering, like, so white allyship fatigue is considered uh, just a sense of exhaustion or just feeling overwhelmed, or the intensity of the work required is a little bit too much or more than they bargained for when they actually, when it comes down to brass tacks. But there is an inherent privilege in being able to tap out. We recognize that as well. But is there a recovery period where white allies eventually just come back to the fight after a period of, we'll just call it respite? Or do they generally leave and stay away after burning out?
So I define white fatigue as a quasi form of resistance. It's resistance, but it's not quite resistance. It's not, an outright rejection in that regard, but a quasi form of resistance in which white folks who believe that racism is wrong, yet still have struggles with understanding how racism functions, how it works. So, for example, you could have a friend who may be white, who is cool and is good people, but then an unarmed black kid gets shot and he doesn't quite understand what all the fuss is about or why that's an example of institutional or systemic racism, right? Just using that as an example. So the thing is that we all are in various places in our own racial understanding, or as we eggheads say, our own racial identity development. And depending on where you are in your own process of development is going to indicate whether or not you're the kind of person who is just going to get fatigued and needs to take a step back for a second and regroup and then get back into it, or if you're somebody who's just going to just walk away from it and or walk away from it and continue to promote ideas that run counter to anti-racism. And I think that's also the difference between an ally and an accomplice, because I think accomplices have a deep and profound understanding of how racism and and other systems of oppression work, and see what their own role is and how they're positioned in that conversation and how to use their privilege and so on and so forth to advance anti-racist activities. But for the ally, well, even just me as a black man, you know, I get tired. I'm so sorry. I get tired because there are times when, you know, it's like you wake up and it's like another news report, another YouTube video, you know, or then just doing the labor of engaging in this, you know, another session, another panel, another workshop, so on and so forth. So and these topics are challenging topics. I mean, they're supposed to be challenging topics. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here talking about it, right? You know, if this was all easily solved. But I think it takes a lot of spiritual effort as well as intellectual effort to understand and to engage in these issues successfully. So I think fatigue happens to everyone. So I don't think that, you know, anybody should necessarily feel bad that they get fatigued. It's not getting fatigued that's the issue. It's what do you do to get through that fatigue, and whether or not you actually continue to pick up the fight.
I thank you for that, Joseph. Um, so back to the safe space. I think I'm just going to go ahead and say that I am losing my patience around conversations about how to make or keep white people comfortable. I don't have the time. I mean, you know, when we think about fatigue, hell, I'm tired now. It's not even that I get tired sometimes. I'm tired today, you know, and I do the kind of work that supports folks that are in social movements, you know. Um, you know, folks of color, Black people in particular, don't do this, you know, social justice work as a hobby. It's not something that we do when we have the time, when we're rested and resourced. It's like literally a matter of survival and safety. But we're conditioned to continually ask white people what they need and how they feel. And those same considerations are rarely offered to the people of color, often women of color, queer folk of color, who are on the ground, who are in community every day. People need retirements and sabbaticals and childcare and plain old rest. So just no, I don't. No, I don't have time. So white people, I don't care if you get tired. I love you down, but I actually, you know, I'm not concerned with that. Like, be tired, and still, you know, make the decisions that you need to make every day to do the right thing. It's just, I don't know. I don't know what else to say, sort of other than what. And it's like I'm not even tired just for now. I'm tired from generations of folks who didn't get enough rest. You know, I sort of watched my grandmother who was a domestic, my other grandmother who was, you know, an agricultural worker who sharecropped. What they didn't ever get was rest. You know, so no, it's
Mm,
probably all I have to say.
no, understood, and received. I think one of the reasons why that question was posed is because there's been a noticeable drop off in allyship support from late summer to now. Um, and it's a palpable, you know, drop off. Like, you go out in the streets, and the most of the people that you're going to see protesting and marching and rallying are probably going to look like us. And I don't know, you know, how to reconcile that with the fact that, you know, once things are more in vogue or more in fashion, they will come back into the fold. You know, hashtags will start to appear on more Twitter bios. Um, all of these things, you know, happen. So I think it's an important thing to consider when you're talking about fatigue, and what Shawnda was saying with regard to not having the option of sitting it out this year, and picking back up in the spring when you have a little bit more time and you have someone to watch your kids while you're out in the streets protesting. It's literally like we've seen people with their children out in the streets protesting. So thank you, panelists, for answering that question. And the next one would be, how should white
Before we go on,
allies? Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I just want to throw in there real quick. It's also the way that all of this information was communicated to people last summer. I think people had this idea that I think people walked away from a lot of these conversations thinking, well, if I watch 13th and I read the new Jim Crow, then I'm an ally and I understand.
Mm-hmm.
And what my colleagues and I were telling people is like, no, that's a part of what you need to do. But if you read that book and watch that documentary and you don't talk to family members about it, you don't talk to friends about it, you don't talk to coworkers about it, then what's the point? you
Mm-hmm.
know they people don't recognize that these are processes that we go through, and learning how to be an anti-racist, let alone learning how to be an ally or accomplice, that unfolds over time. So you're absolutely right, and that was one of the fears that I and many of my colleagues had at the beginning of the summer, as the protest began in June. We were worried. It was like, by the time we get back to the fall and we start school again, how many folks are still going to be actively engaged in learning about learning how to understand and live out these values?
Yeah, and I'll just jump in really quickly there because one, I just agree with that completely. Also, I don't want to confuse the fact that I don't think people need to have rest, right? I think all people need rest, and I think that we sort of engage at various levels and ebbs and flows. Like, trust me, I'm not like a 100% like ride or die all the time, always in the streets. Like that's just not how it works for me. I think in addition to sort of the fact that like folks go back to school and interest changes, like you know we're in the middle of a global public health crisis, a global economic crisis. People sort of are literally dying, from a really invisible virus. So there's a whole host of reasons why sort of people aren't, necessarily as visibly active. But I think that a real at for allyship to sort of be not performative, it matters most sort of what you do when people aren't looking at you, when you're not about to get credit. What matters is sort of what conversations are you going to be silent about while you're playing golf with your partners, or where you're at the dinner table with your in-laws, like in those quiet moments, how are you showing up? So yeah, I just wanted to make that distinction. I think we all need to make sure that we have rest. I just what I won't do is sort of like sacrifice conversations, around things that are substantial so that we can continue to make white people comfortable.
Understood. And you mentioned something just there, Shawnda, that I want you to kind of like give the attendees and everyone else that are watching a little bit of understanding about. You mentioned performative. Now, what exactly is performative allyship, and what are some of the questions? Like you mentioned, dinner table conversations, but what are some of the questions that allies should ask themselves to make sure that they're actually not participating in it? And is there a way for, on the other side of that fence, is there a way for people who are actually in the movement, Black-led movements, to actually see performative allyship, when it greets them at the door? And I just want to ask you to adjust your mic just a little bit so we can make sure we hear everything you got to say, because we know you're coming with the heat. Thank you.
How's this? Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Um, it's interesting. I language is important to me, and in the same way, I'm not wedded to language. So we say these terms like performative allyship or passive allyship, um, but they're just words. It's jargon. For most people. So I think there's just a matter of what are you doing? What are you actually doing? If what you did was sort of change the frame on your Facebook page to a little, rainbow flag, does that mean that you're like actively an ally to say the LGBTQ community? But if you're in a meeting per se, and you say, I notice who's missing at this table, you know, I've been here too long. How about I create some space for somebody who isn't here? Like, what are you actually doing to shift power? Like, what are you doing to move resources, right? Otherwise, what you might be doing is performing something, and you might be sort of getting the benefits from sort of this identification sort of as an ally without actually contributing to change.
Mm. Do you have anything to add, James?
No, I think that was great. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. So the next question would be, how should white allies check themselves when they are overstepping boundaries or unaware of their blind spots? And what are some examples of blind spots that white people may be unaware of?
Could you contextualize that a little more for me?
So the whole thing about, I guess, centering. A lot of times, white allies will maybe unknowingly, maybe not, don't know their motives, but it happens often in the movement where white allies are centering themselves in conversations, feeling attacked personally by critique or being called out, uh, maybe from by being a performative ally. And so this turns into overstepping or assuming responsibilities that they have not been assigned by Black leadership, and it coming off as if they're trying to take control over, maybe part or all of the organization. So these are some things that I was thinking about when I was talking about overstepping.
I think that's interesting. I think the um, I'm constantly, there's usually like a person that's in sort of that sits here and she's like, Shawnda, stop it. Don't say those things. And then there's another person who's like, girl, let them have it. Um, I think it's important to sort of differentiate a little bit from sort of Black social movements from, say, Black, Indigenous, queer, or other sort of specific spaces. Sort of working on things in a movement broadly is not the same. Sort of, you can have a multicultural space that seeks to impact change around racial justice. That's completely possible, right? But you can also have a space that's sort of very intentionally Black and Black led, right? And so then it's like, how do you show up in those various spaces might be different. I think um, if I were to just sort of give an example of sort of being an ally, at your house, Rico, right, or Joseph, if I was going to some ally with you, if I came to your house, right, in your house, and started telling you where to put things, right? If I came to your house sort of with the assumption that I knew better than you where all the things should go, right? If I came into your house and like with the assumption that I knew best sort of how to allocate resources, you would look at me and be like, you got to go, you got to get out my house because this is my house, right? You can't come up in here and show up like that. And I think the same thing for say Black social movement spaces. You can't. This is not your house. It's like I may have an interest in making sure that this house is taken care of. I may be concerned for the people in the house because I value the lives of the people in the house, but it's not my house, right? I've heard the old people say something like, if they don't want it, it's not a blessing. You know, it's like you're not helping if that's not what they want. So that, to some degree, then what you have to do is really sort of, be okay with the fact that this is a space that you don't have control and that your voice doesn't matter sort of as much. And what you're there to do is support, not sort of be decision makers. And I think it's okay to say, you know what, I don't want to do that. Oh, that's not how I want to make change. But I think that, if you're really interested sort of in advancing movements, you have to get to the place where you can be comfortable with the fact that no, your opinion doesn't matter as much, in this space. And um, you gotta step back. You gotta take a little time and step back. Joseph, what do you think about that? I know I've said a few things. I see Joseph. He looks very concerned.
Oh
Uh,
no, 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 not at all, not at all. Because I mean, what you're saying reminds me of what Stokely Carmichael was writing about in Black Power, which holds up considerably. And one of the chapters is called The Myth of Coalitions. And he was basically making that argument that the Black Power movement didn't necessarily have anything against white people specifically. It was that when white allies would come into their spaces, into planning meetings and whatnot, they had a tendency of trying to take over, trying to take control, trying to silence vigorous debate about strategy, let alone goals and purposes. And his point was, if you're going to come into a space, you got to come humble, you got to come correct. You can't come in thinking that you know everything just because, and furthermore, if you really want to be an ally, you need to go into the spaces where we can't go to spread this message. So yeah, the entire time you were talking, that was what immediately came to my mind. So like, this is an old problem, right? It's always been around. But I think a part of it is also the development of this larger white culture, and the idea of the rugged individual, and how individualism and the self becomes the center of everything. It's not, if you make a critical statement about white folks and whiteness, just a general statement, and that gets taken personally, even if you're saying statistics show that the white community in general does X, Y, and Z, or displays X, Y, and Z, a white person then takes that as an attack on her or himself. And it's like, well, we're not talking about you specifically.
I mean, sometimes we are talking about you.
Sometimes we are. Sometimes we are.
Sometimes
we
you.
are.
No, it's you, ma'am, sir.
I think, just generally, there's that kind of knee-jerk reaction. I think it's culturally bound, because, we do know that cultures, in terms of like having a more communal focus versus a more individual focus, we know that there's a reality to that. We know that historically African Americans and Latinos have traditionally been more communal focused in the ways in which they interact, while Western Europeans tended to be much more individualized. It's all about what you do, the work that you do, the effort that you put in, as opposed to thinking about, how does this, work in terms of the collective community. So I kind of get where it comes from, but again, if you're trying to be an ally, there you have to understand, and I guess I'll put it this way, you got to understand your place. And you have to understand that there were people working on this long before you got in here. So maybe the best thing for you to do is just sit in the back pew, or sit in the back row, or sit in, over on the side and listen for a while and follow, and not feel like you have to be the leader all the time.
Absolutely. When I think about sort of the ways I show up as an ally, I'm taking all my cues from the folks that are most impacted. Bottom line, and that's, thinking about the ways I want to be a better ally to my trans folk, thinking about the way I want to be a better ally to youth, and that especially comes up when we think about youth justice. We don't trust youth. That's it. And, in the same way, that a lot of times white folks don't trust Black folks. Like, we get to the actual real heart of it. It's like we think we know better, so I will come in here and I will save you from yourself, people, because I know these things. And I think that there's something that has to say, I'm going to step back, and I'm going to let the people who are closest to any particular problem, they will lead, and I will support in the ways that I can be supportive. And there are times, as an adult, being proximate to youth movements, I'm just like, that's the hardest thing to do. They're youth, and it's like we're socialized to think they're just not even full people, anyway. So it's like, yeah, that's cute, that's cute. All right, now you came, you said your little thing. Now let us tell you what to do. No, actually, what are the ways that we can put in place, sort of, decision making structures where youth are at the top. Ultimately, they decide, when we are thinking about sort of priorities, it's like, it's not what I would do, but they decided. And how do we support them?
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned something about trust, and how easily that trust can be broken, and how long it takes to regain trust. there's a history of the federal government intervening in our liberation affairs. You know, going back further, but you know, one of the main ones and one of the ones that was the most exposed was COINTELPRO, which was a prong of the FBI. So when disruption starts to happen with white allies in Black-led movements, there's a lot of side-eyeing going on, and there's a lot of red flags that are raised. So I guess I want you to, if you can, both of you, give examples of how Black folks in these movements look, or give an example of what disruption could look like that a white ally might not be aware is actually disruption.
I don't know if I understand your question completely.
So the disruption, go ahead. No, I was going to say the disruption that happens because of overstepping boundaries or because of being, you know, feeling personally attacked. How does that show up in these spaces? Like, what does it look like? What are the behaviors that you actually see that are associated with the disruption, whether it's intentional or not?
White folks disrupting or Black?
Yes.
Well, an example, I mean, exactly what we've been talking about, you know, just standing up in the middle of a meeting and telling people that the way that they're thinking is wrong. You know, that's a disruption. As you know, if a debate begins to unfold and it gets a little bit heated, telling them that we have to settle down now, we have to mellow out, you know, and trying to silence that that dialogue, that debate, you know, that's a disruption. Asking too many questions. I mean, you know, depending on the kinds of questions that are being asked, asking too many questions, you know, or doing that, you know, 1-2 punch of making it about oneself, or, you know, trying to come into the space and wrestle the spotlight. You know, all those are disruptions that oftentimes happen without people, you know, not necessarily intending to do something, you know, especially when it comes to things like trying to guide dialogue. You know, it's not necessarily always done in the effort of being rude or in the effort of derailing. Sometimes it's done with the best of intentions, but it's still having that effect, and people need to be called out on that, you know, on that impact. I don't know if people necessarily always need to be called out full blown in public in front of everybody, or if somebody just needs to pull them to the side and just be like, hey, you know, when we're trying to talk about and trying to work our thing out, don't tell us to be quiet, because that's part of the problem, right? Because, you know, because I think that reaction comes, or that the attempt to silence comes because of this fear of emotion, this fear of, you know, well, if people get loud, then the next thing you know, they're going to start fighting, you know, and it's just like, nah, it's not always like that. You know, sometimes, you know, volume doesn't necessarily always communicate anger. Most of the time, volume communicates excitement and investment, you know, and if you can't differentiate between the two, then you really need to sit down and just listen and see how people behave in the moment and then after that moment, because usually it's nothing but love afterwards. We have complex and multiple ideas and complex and multiple ways of seeing the world, and that can change from, in this case, Black person to Black person, queer person to queer person, woman to woman, you know, so on and so forth. So, you know, those are some ways that, you know, so-called allies, I'm not necessarily going to call them allies at this point, if they're doing that kind of stuff, then they have a lot more to learn.
Yeah, I think that for any sort of social space that you're going to be in, you might want to sort of figure out what the norms of that social space are, and not try to make those shift them around your comfortability, right? So if there's a space that's just too loud for you, too excitable, you know, there might be some other space, you know. But I think just the matter of sort of shifting, of trying to sort of shift those things to sort of meet your comfort are sort of the things that I think about a lot. Um, I think, if we're talking about sort of, at its, simplest, if we're spending time talking about your feelings, probably that's a disruption. If what we're doing is not actually talking about the work we need to do and talking about how you felt and how you are feeling, that's often a telltale sign that we're in the middle of probably a disruption. Um, but that's not to say that that's exclusive to sort of any race or any gender. But since we're talking about white allyship, particular sort of in some of these spaces, and the way that shows up, I think that happens to be a thing. Um, but eh, I think that there's sort of ways, it's just sort of one of the most simple ways that you can sort of sow discord and sort of get people sort of focused on not doing sort of what they came to do.
Mm.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of, a lot of people think they know a lot about Martin Luther King Jr., and most people don't, which is kind of a shame. But one of the things that people don't like immediately recognize is during the civil rights movement and all those strategizing sessions, they weren't all just old Negro spirituals and sitting around holding hands. I mean, those meetings, according to the history, they could get contentious, shouting, yelling, people walking out, because they understood the importance of what it was that they were trying to do, and they understood the challenges of what they were trying to do. So, some camps you had, folks wanted a little bit more aggression, and other camps, people didn't, and they had to, engage in deep, sustained dialogue to make that happen. So it kind of makes me wonder, and an example of that from pop culture is Ava DuVernay's film on King, Selma, and there are a couple of scenes where they're behind the scenes strategizing how to do this, and I think it's important for people to see that, because people have to recognize that when you're engaged in this kind of work, people come to the table with different ideas about how to achieve a similar goal. And that has to be negotiated. Ideas get built, strategies get built, and oftentimes that building can be contentious in some spaces. And so, I think, recognizing that contention is a part of activism, and learning how to see where each other is coming from and coming to some kind of compromise is how strategy gets built and how you get buy-in. So seeing that messiness and having that and understanding that that's a part of things, I think, is an important thing.
Mm. What ways can white allies actually leverage their white privilege? I'm sure that's a term that most people in attendance are familiar with. Uh, how can they use that to leverage for advancement of Black-led social justice movements? And what are some reasonable asks of white people in doing that?
I think, and mind you, I'm gonna bump that out, just beyond um, Black social movements and just thinking about just allyship and in general. And I think that, I think you start by thinking about, how am I creating space for folks at tables that I sit at? When I get there, am I thinking about who's missing here, right? And what power do I have to make sure that folks have some space at those tables? I think there's a sort of conversation or a dialogue that one has to have with themselves about, not just creating space about, but what are the times that I need to step back? What are the times that I need to sort of cede my power or cede the seat at the table, for somebody else, for someone who is a person of color, for someone who, is queer, for someone who's youth. I think, there's just that sort of, that what you can do personally, just that attention to sort of, to absence and invisibility. I think there's also, and I think we've seen examples of it sort of recently, of folks really using themselves as a whole actual barrier to injustice, sort of physically and otherwise. I've seen where, moms sort of physically made a barrier sort of around folks so that they wouldn't sort of, experience sort of the same sort of brutality that, because they've noticed, I think that there's sort of the way where you make yourself a barrier, in other spaces, where I can intercede here, such that this thing doesn't happen to someone. And so, um, yeah, and I think also, like I mentioned before, thinking about what you're doing to sort of create safety, to shift power, to move resources, especially in moments where nobody is watching, where you are not going to be praised and when you are not going to get credit.
I completely concur. 100% agree. I would just add, use that voice. When you see something or hear something, say something, question someone. If you're at a party or whatnot and you're walking through the room and somebody decides that it's a good idea to tell, a racial joke or a racist joke, just trying to be funny, ask them, well, why is that joke funny? Check them on their stuff and, show your own sense of righteous indignation about treating people inequitably, let alone like humans.
Yeah, one more thing. Stop calling the police on Black people. You know, stop calling the police. Stay out of HR. Talking about somebody did something to you. Stop.
Like if you can't have a conversation with that person, you got to go and put them, at risk.
Literally, yeah. Like stop using authority, to be your customer service to sort of make these people, because it's like everything is good when you're sort of happy, but what about those moments, where somebody made you upset and you decided to access that power that you have, to sort of make them pay. Stop doing that. You're an ally. Don't do it. Don't change the little banner on your Facebook if you are still out here doing that. I do not want to see the Black Lives Matter, circling your face if this is what you're doing. If yesterday you made that complaint in HR, I don't want to talk to you.
Valid, very valid, all of it. So I guess the next thing I want to ask about is white fragility. There was a author who wrote a book, a New York Times bestseller about it. So it's been topic of conversation, but it also requires a lot of energy, and it requires us to deal with it in these movements, to the point where it can turn into, I don't know, an example would be attacking Black leadership, because somebody felt that uncomfortable, making them out to be a big Black boogeyman or angry Black woman. The tropes roll on and on and on. Should white allies just simply grow a thick skin instead of being fragile, or are there ways that they can make sure their fragility doesn't take up as much space in the fight for social justice?
Well, again, I think that fragility and more extreme forms of white resistance happen more often to people who aren't well developed in their own racial identity, or don't have a more positive white racial identity and recognize how their wagon is hitched to everyone else's wagon. But I think in the short term, on the short order, yeah, folks need to grow a thicker skin and recognize some of the things that we've been saying, that critiques against whiteness or critiques about whiteness in American society isn't necessarily about every individual white person, and that there is truth and legitimacy to the things that we're saying. Now, if you're someone who didn't do those kinds of things, who never went out of their way to disrespect anybody or dehumanize anyone, okay, then you should know that we're not trying to indict you as an individual. And I think that's a part of where that sense of fragility comes from. It's this fear of, quote unquote, being attacked. whether it's legitimate or not. And so I think, dealing with fragility, on one hand, you have to know in the back of your mind that you got to grow a thicker skin. You have to understand where people come from. I was doing a workshop last summer. It was more of a panel last summer, and a student had asked me, how do you ask a Black person questions about these issues without making them angry? And I was like, well, I was like, how am I supposed to tell you that? And what makes you think that there's some magic recipe, this magic formula that's going to make sure that if you ask a question, whether it's a stupid question or otherwise, that that Black person is not going to, get hot about it? I can't guarantee that. So the thing that you need to do, if you want to ask that question, first, where are your Black allies to ask those questions to? Secondly, if they get cross, understand why folks get cross when asked questions like that in the first place. And then finally, to accept all that, grow a thicker skin and recognize that the bash isn't necessarily simply about you as a person. It's about the experience of being a Black male, a Black man or a woman, and every time an unarmed Black kid gets shot, having to go through this whole conversation all over again. Like the conversations that we were having about George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor last summer were the exact same conversations that we were having when George Zimmerman was acquitted. And that was what, 2014? So 6 years ago? It was the same conversation we had after Eric Garner. It was the same conversation after Philando Castile. So the anger comes from having to always answer these questions again and again and again. Every time there's an urban uprising, invariably, especially on certain news networks that are on cable that are named after animals, Fox. Every time something like that, every time an uprising happens, there are always people saying, well, I don't understand why they're rioting. I don't understand why they're looting. And that answer has been provided ever since the 65 Watts riots. So when we have to return to these answers again and again and again that are easily available through a simple Google search, it's frustrating. And I think, white folks or folks that are trying to identify themselves as an ally on any front needs to understand that. You got to do your homework too, just like we have. I told one group of students that I wasn't born with all this knowledge. I had to pick up books over the years and read them. I had to have conversations with people. I had to watch documentaries, oftentimes outside of my general curriculum that I was learning in school. So I had to pick this up on my own, and people need to recognize that. Again, it's a process.
I'm gonna land the plane, and I'm gonna try to land the plane, and I'm gonna be on my best behavior. I promise I'm gonna do my best to be on my best behavior here. There's a poet sister in community who has this saying, or there's a line in one of her poems that says that it is exhausting trying to explain to fire that it burns. And I fear, a part of the way that we're having this conversation makes it seem like this concept of fragility is benign, and it's not. And I've been as you were talking, Joseph, I was sort of thinking through there was something that didn't feel right, but I was sort of thinking through, like, what is this thing, right? And part of it is that it's like the way that we're having this conversation is almost this explanation for white people. Again, like it's back to then, again, we're conditioned to make, you see these, my children, then won't let me be great. we're conditioned again to make sure that white people are comfortable, sort of consistently. And we're conditioned to sort of explain to them that we're safe for them. We are safe. Please, white people, we are not violent. I know that this sounds like anger to you, but it is not. Be okay with us. Do not harm us, right? And I think that sort of the thing that sort of is sort of not sitting well with me is that that thing is sort of the basis for the brutality that sort of gets met out on Black people. And so the way that we continue to have this conversation, sort of around, why they need to, it's not just you need to grow a tougher skin. It's that sort of your argument is flawed from the beginning, right? And then it's like as a result of that argument, violence and brutality gets met out on Black people. And
Mm,
so, I I guess it's more of a statement, and I feel like this is a thought that's in process, um, but it's not benign at all. Sort of this, it's not about whether your feelings got hurt because somebody talked to you, sideways. If it were just that simple, it's like, oh, feelings hurt, go home. And but it means that somehow because we're having this conversation about Black people sort of as inherently violent, that somebody may lose their life. And I think that, when I think about Cooper, was that woman's name Karen? Her name is probably not Karen. Was it Karen?
Amy Cooper. She was a
Amy, I've just called her Karen Cooper because that, makes most sense. When I think about sort of Amy Cooper, this was not about whether her feelings were hurt. This was about what could have happened, as a result. And it's not that she didn't know, it is why she made the phone call. She told him, all right, I'm going to do this thing. So this wasn't about her as fragile. This was about sort of using her power under the guise of fragility to sort of mete out violence, to be able to call the police, to act as her customer service and do that violence. So yeah, I just want to figure out how to have a fuller conversation, sort of about what it actually is and then what the consequences are. Because you know what, hurt feelings. I don't care. Again, we talked about this really earlier on in the conversation. Feels that hurt. But when it means that somebody's losing their life, we're having an entirely different conversation.
Indeed. I want you to put a pin in that just for a second. I want to reach out to all the attendees and let them know that we'll actually be giving you the opportunity to ask panelists your questions. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand. We'll try something a little bit different this time. I was previously reading the questions, but if my tech skills are engaged enough, I'm going to actually give you the opportunity to speak your questions to the panelists. So start raising hands and we'll ask the panelists a few more questions and get right into your Q&A. So
before you go, that was a really, really great example. Thank you for that, for real. Because I think that, words like white fragility just get used as a blanket statement. And we don't take the time to really stop and say, well, wait a minute, that's not fragility right there. That's aggression. She weaponized that entire situation, right? And that's not fragility. Fragility would have been she, ran away, but she knew exactly what she was doing because she purposely looked at that man in the face and said, I'm going to get you in trouble, right? So thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Shawnda, for that. And then also I wanted to just let attendees know if you're a little bit shy and you don't want to actually speak your questions, you can also just drop them into the Q&A and I will ask them for you. So with the pin taken out, the conversation about talking to white people about their fragility. So we in the Black community have a phrase, go get your cousins. What about white folks calling each other out, talking to their people about the mess that they are stirring up? How do you feel about that? Is that useful, a useful tool? And what if white allies don't feel comfortable in doing that?
Could you repeat the question for me?
No problem. So talk to your cousin, go get your cousin. You know that phrase, right? So with what you were talking about with regard to always having to exhaust your energy on making white folks feel comfortable when they are disrupting or when they feel fragile or whatever, and shifting that responsibility or taking it off the shoulders of Black folks in the movement and putting it onto that of white allies to get other white allies. Go get their cousins, in other words. So I'm just trying to figure out, do you feel like that would be an answer to that, to alleviating the stress and the burden from white leadership or Black leadership and Black folks in the movement? And does it work? Do you feel like it would be helpful, useful?
Yeah, absolutely. White women, liberal white women, I'm looking at you in the face. 55%. Go out and get your people. Yeah. I don't know that there's anything else to say. I just wanted to like very pointedly say, I'm looking at y'all. Go out and do that work because we're not going to do it. They already don't like us. So it has to be you if it's going to get done. Please and thank you.
Yeah, there's there's too many places that we can't go, you know, and to try to have a sensible conversation about race, and so white folks have to step up and be a part, you know, because this isn't simply a Black issue, right? This is an American issue, and to be completely honest, you know, speaking of getting in trouble, we aren't. I don't think that this is our responsibility in the first place. You know, you look at it. Black folks weren't passing Jim Crow policies. Black folks didn't institute slavery. Black folks didn't, you know, start eugenics programs against white people. Black folks didn't mount, you know, a 6-7 decades long lynching campaign. You know,
Black people didn't go to the Capitol and do a coup, people. It's y'all.
Black people
Stop it.
did not
Sorry.
sail ships to Western Europe and start, you know, kidnapping folks or trading folks and enslaving them. You know, we didn't do that stuff. It's white folks stuff that did. And so white people have the ultimate responsibility for doing something to, you know, solve those the problems that were born out of that struggle. So yeah, white people, y'all need to start talking to each other.
You're gonna have to now. Out of the closet, you know, they're climbing over fences, you know, breaking doors down. That's who's gonna do that? That's not gonna be us. So
there's a lot of research out there that shows that messages about race or instruction about race is grossly is perceived grossly differently if the instructor is white versus the instructor is Black. I've taught a class with a colleague of mine, a white dude. We had different sections, but we taught the exact same syllabus. We met before class, talked about what examples that we would give, so on and so forth. We had the exact same stuff. His students ate it up. My white students were resistant, you know, to the extent that, you know, I've been called racist on my teaching evaluations because I talked about white privilege, you know. So yeah, it is very real in the field that sometimes the ways that messages about anti-racism get perceived by Black folks is ill, you know. So white folks, y'all need to step up and start talking.
Last question. Do we need white allies in Black-led social justice movements?
Yeah. As uncomfortable as I don't want, as uncomfortable as I am in saying yeah, I think we do. And if anything, as a matter of practicality, I don't think that we need white folks to love who we are, to respect ourselves as a culture and a community, to appreciate our history. We don't need white people for that. But when it comes to changing or solving these systemic and institutional problems, we need white folks because they control the votes, they control government, they control access to resources, they control representations and images and media and pop culture. So yeah, we do need white allies and accomplices as a part of this struggle. And again, there have always been, but I think that we definitely need a critical mass in this country that are understanding of that, because white folks do wield an incredible amount of power as a larger group. You know, and of course, within that larger group, there are individuals have varying degrees of power. But yeah, if we want to change law and policy, we need white allies to step up and take that seriously.
Mm. Shawnda?
I think all sort of places where there are imbalances of power need allies. They need people who hold the majority of that power to cede that power. Um, yeah, I think it's a simple thing, right? And I think if you sort of understand sort of all of our destinies are tied up, in one another's, then I think that sort of that investment has returns.
Mm.
Um, so I think that's a simple yes, of course.
Okay. Okay, so now we'll go into the questions from the attendees. We have Jax, who would like to ask a question. Jax, you got the mic.
Hi, thank you so much for hosting this. It's been really informative. Um, I am a white passing person of color, and I've been tasked with leading the racial justice affinity group at my work. And I'm really struggling with amplifying Black voices because our Black employees, there are very few of them in a white dominant company, and are extremely fatigued. So I was hoping to ask you, what are ways that I can extend my power and like help people speak up more and also feel less fatigued by contributing to the work that I'm trying to do.
I wonder, can I ask you a question? I wonder
Yes.
if I wonder to some degree, sort of how much you feel like an island, or how much you sort of are sort of in conversation with some of the folks whose voices you hope to amplify. And and if you sort of engaging in a strategy together, or sort of if it's a matter of I see this need, I'm going to go do these things, go do this thing.
Well, my organizing effort started in the beginning of the summer with all of the killings, and the majority of my Black fellow workers are in like entry level positions where I am at. So they're like much more colleagues to me and like my very close friends. So then there's like that friendship and like coworker boundary and also the advocacy boundary. So I'm definitely working with them and talking to them as much as possible, but I also don't want to be that annoying person who's asking too many questions.
Yeah, I'll again, I don't speak for like all the Black people and all the things, or even know. I just know that I've been in situations like that, and I've been in situations where there were people who maybe weren't white passing, but maybe um, sort of were ambiguous people of color, people who were not Black. So if we were looking, just sort of at the sort of spectrum, who would make decisions. They would hear things and they would do their best to sort of be subversive. And they would have conversations and just say, how can I help? Is this a helpful thing? Um, yeah, I think that it's uncomfortable, but there's just the matter of the fact that you can't do it alone. And I think that you might have to have a community outside of your workspace, um, that you can sort of be sort of in a learning community around, and sort of you can sort of be a co-conspirator, as the word was, sort of around, how do I use this power that I have? I know that I have this. What would be helpful? If that were something that you were interested in. Um, but hats off to you for at least, sort of locating yourself there and saying that I have a privilege and there's a thing that I can do.
Thank you so much for your advice.
Okay, so we have another question from Joseph. Joseph, the mic is yours. Joseph, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can. You got the mic.
it's I guess a comment. Uh, Again, my name is Joseph. I'm with Black Lives Matter, Greater New York, and I just want to thank the panel. Excellent. The panel members, Rico, you had beautiful. You had mentioned overstepping. I think it was you that mentioned that. I had experienced that. Um, Joseph comments on disruption. I have experienced that. But I'm sure we all know when you experience things like this and when you speak up, you are marginalized. That I have experienced. Um, uh, you mentioned about fragility. I was called a anti-Semite for actually bringing that up. The book you're talking about is by Robin DiAngelo. For the first time, and I'm 73 years old, 72 years old. And that was the first time for actually raising the issue, uh, the disruption you're talking about. You get marginalized, attempts to be silenced, and it goes on and on. So this has been I'm glad I made it. It's my first time on this chat here. And I'm glad I made it. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you, all.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you. Appreciate that. We have a question from Luis. He's asking, where do brown and yellow people fall on the allyship spectrum with regard to this discussion? Anybody can jump in.
Personally, I always kind of like in my head, the way I normally think about things is I think white, non-white. That's the kind of the binary I live by. So I find that, I know that I speak most specifically about African Americans and the African American experience primarily because that's who I am, and that's where most of my work resides. So by reflex, that's how I frame the conversation. But I think that these ideas apply across groups and even within groups. So first and foremost, I don't mean to dismiss or silence or delegitimize my Latino and Asian and Indigenous brothers and sisters as part of this conversation. And I think that a lot of, especially when it comes to the issues those communities are facing nationally as well as individually, are products of systemic oppression, systemic and institutional oppression. And so I kind of see them and construct them for myself as being similar to what has and does happen to African Americans. Because, historically, you do see this very sharp distinction between people who were able to be labeled as white versus people who were not. And so, I kind of just generally use the term African American, speaking specifically about the African American experience, definitely, but using African American as more of just a proxy term for any group of any group of historically marginalized people. Now, I also think that it is important for all groups, especially historically marginalized groups, to see their commonalities and stand up in support of each other. So I do believe that African Americans should definitely be standing up and supporting the struggles for indigenous rights, as well as, Latinos should stand up and support concerns or attacks against Asian communities. so to a certain degree, I think that all of these things apply to everyone that is in any position of power in their attempt to be allies, let alone accomplices to other groups.
I will say that I just differ slightly. I don't do my binaries at all at any places in my life, to say the truth. So I think I tend to think about race on a continuum, sort of with white being at one end and sort of black sort of at the at the other sort of end of that continuum, and sort of thinking about the fact that we're having this conversation sort of with sort of anti-blackness sort of being at the most sort of distal place there, and sort of locating themselves somewhere on that continuum, sort of in relationship to your position of power, right? And so thinking about just first one, locating themselves there, and then thinking about, well, what privileges do I have, sort of as a result, sort of as of my various social locations, and so what are those ways that sort of I can partner? Sort of what are those ways that sort of my positions allow me access, that other people don't have. Um, so yeah, I hope that answers your question, but I don't do binary. Sort of I don't do the sort of either or kind of thing. It's sort of where on this continuum am I? And you can think about it with race. You can think about it with gender. You can think about it with ability. Where am I? I think that's just broadly the conversation around allyship starts with where am I sort of in relationship to power and oppression, and so and what sort of what do my various privileges afford me, which ones am I willing to give up, and what places can I use that privilege to sort of get in there, and sort of create some change.
Yeah, I got a cosign on that because that's to use those terms. That's intersectionality all the way down the line. It's a pretty complex question when you really think about it, because you could be a black person who's white passing, right? And so how does that change that that sense of allyship and engagement? So yes, I agree.
Cool. And we have our last question from PJ. PJ, you have the mic. PJ, you there? PJ going once, going twice, and looks like PJ may have taken a nap on us. It's too bad. All right, so there you have it, our wonderful panel. We have Joseph E. Flynn. I erroneously called him James earlier. Sorry about that.
That's all good. PJ's back, by the way.
Okay. And we also have Shawnda Chapman. Each of you just briefly tell everyone where they can follow you on social media or to stay abreast of what you're doing in your respective fields of study and research.
Joseph, you're famous. You should go first.
What Joseph are you talking to?
I read your CV. I'm like, you should certainly go first. Okay, fine. Since you won't.
You can find me at JEFlynn, Twitter.com, or on Facebook, search Joseph Flynn, and you should be able to find me. I actually have two pages on Facebook. One's like supposed to be my professional page that I never pay attention to, and the other is my personal page, which I never pay attention to anymore either. I got real angry with Mark Zuckerberg for a while, so I was like, yeah.
A lot of people do. You're not alone. Shawnda?
See, that was my whole point. Joseph has two Facebook pages. Like, you know what I mean? You totally proved my point for me. Oh no! Seriously, wonderful. I just appreciate being in conversation with both of you. Really, great dialogue. I hope I didn't get myself into too much trouble today.
No.
You can follow me on Twitter at Shawnda Chapman B. I am on Facebook. I guess it's just Shawnda Chapman. Yeah, I'm on all the social medias. Just hit a quick Google and connect with me. Sort of around my philanthropic work at the Men's Foundation. I'm to get in contact with.
Wonderful. And again, if you don't know, you can always keep up to date with Street Riders across all platforms at StreetRidersNYC. Thank you very much to our panelists for their generosity and their broad knowledge base. And hopefully they've given you something of substance to carry home with you. Well, actually, everybody is home. So hopefully they've given you something of substance that you can use in your everyday life. And have a good night.
Take care, everybody. Thanks a lot.
Good night, everyone. Bye.
Take care.